What's going on? I wanted to talk about something for a moment about all the shit that's going on in these sanctuary cities. Now, Trump is sending the National Guard into all these different places and this and that. Then you have all these major sanctuary cities. They keep talking about, oh, what we're doing, and we're throwing band aids, on the issue, we're throwing band aids on the problem. The National Guard is there to be administrative. They're not going to be chasing criminals down and doing all this kind of stuff. And they say, the presence is not going to change anything. And for the most part, there's some truth to that because the problem goes very deep. And people don't ever pay attention to why these people, especially, I'm conservative. A lot of people conservative. I don't like what conservatives, is becoming because, they got this false religion, Christianity, For the most part, most people believe in Christianity just to have something to believe in for the most part. But, Christianity is a lie, just like every other religion. They're all just control systems. And so, especially what's going on now, they're trying to like pull everybody in this on the conservative side into Christianity. I don't believe in Christianity. I don't believe that morals come from the Bible. Morals come from there's plenty of cultures out there who never even seen a Bible who have morals. There's atheists, who have morals. Morals don't come from the Bible. You know what I mean? Even the structure of the family that we see in Christianity and stuff doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from nature. You know what I mean? And so Christianity is just the religion that this nation has adopted. And it was very important, that I heard Trump say something, you know, and I latched on to it. One of the things Trump said, when he was asking, like, why is this nation a Christian nation? It's like, it's a Christ. We believe in Christianity. We believe this nation believes in God, and because we want to be a good country. If you don't have anything to believe in, what's the point of being a good country? What is leading you to be a good country? You see what I'm saying? And it's the same thing with like when you talk about atheism, when you talk about creationism and evolutionism, or you know what I mean? And basically, evolution is saying that life is just based on chance, all this and that, nothing really matters, and science, this and that. And so when you live that kind of mindset, nothing matters. You can rule over people, you can do what you want to do, nothing matters. You don't have to take morality into consideration. You know what I mean? And so when you believe in things like religions, you have something to believe in, something to look forward to, something to build with, and so that's the reason why a lot of people believe in Christianity. It's not the fact that they believe that it's real or anything, it's just something to believe in. It's something to look forward to, right? Because on the other side there's nothing. Life is just a chance, it's just some freak accident. There's no purpose or anything. You see what I'm saying? And so that's why a lot of people believe in that shit. But at the same time, my quarrel with Christianity is because Christianity is covering up the African American history, which is the Old Testament. you know Anybody who do research, you can go through the Old Testament and find that Negroes are those people who are mentioned in the Old Testament. Negroes are the Hebrew Israelites that's mentioned in the Old Testament. You can go through Deuteronomy 28, the curses that's going to be upon his people all the time. Like, all black people fit that curse. At least African Americans is what I mean. Negroes, not Africans. Many people don't even know um, about, where African Americans come from. You know what I mean? Because many lies of the past, you know, tried to get everybody to believe that all black people came from Africa, and that's not true. I mean, every source of history, all go through the archives, you can find that black people were found everywhere. They didn't come from Africa. That's just a lie of the past. Back when we had Darwinism and stuff like that, they said that black people came from apes, and that white people evolved further than us. And so now we're likely to be treated as nothing because we didn't evolve as far as them. That's a lie. And them saying that all black people came from Africa is a part of that same lie. You know what I mean? There's black people everywhere. In fact, there's plenty of historians and all kinds of people, said that pretty much all the religions were started by black people because black people were the majority. Up until the 1400s. After the 1400s, That's when the decline of black rule. That's when we started to see that. Then we talk about the Renaissance. That was the rebirth of the white race. That's when they went and started changing all the paintings and started changing all the figures. Even over in Europe, all the kings, King James and all these people were whitenized versions of them because that's what they did. After the 1400s, the Renaissance hit. That was the rebirth of the white race, and so they went back and changed like all the history that showed that black people were in rule, and so during the time of the Renaissance, they changed all that. That's why you find a lot of those religious icons over in Russia because the Renaissance didn't hit Russia as hard as all these other places, and that's why people see it. And also Christians use that, says we got all these icons of Jesus and stuff like that. There's false religions. You got to remember there were cults. There's always been cults. There's always been false religions. Just because people made images to their idols doesn't mean that those idols are real. You know what I mean? And so, that's the thing. But yeah, that's one thing I don't like about what conservatism is becoming. They're trying to force this Jesus narrative, this Christianity narrative, and I don't care too much for it. It's the same thing, like we want to label all these liberals and nose ring theory and all this stuff, but now we doing the same fucking shit. You're trying to link everybody in with this, and not everybody's like that. You know what I mean? So I get tired of that religious shit because there's lots of problems that's going on here in society, and we're trying to cover it up with religion. You know what I mean? I've heard it all the time, talking about why these men over here killing each other in Chicago. It ain't got nothing to do with them having demonic spirits. They are the demonic spirits. In fact, that's what devil means. Devil means an evil person. Satan just simply means accuser or some adversary. It's not even a freaking title or a name. It's not even the name of an angel. It's just foolishness. Satan just means accuser, somebody who's against you. God himself was accuser when he had an angel speak lies to one of the people who censored Israel. That the Most High himself became Satan. Is what I mean. And it's just foolishness, that we believe in this religious shit. But I mean, this nation did adopt Christianity, and that's the only reason behind it. It's not real. And so, yeah, but there's a lot of real problems going on with these people, and so most of the problem, I grew up in the hood, so I know what they go through. I know, I've been there, and I had to turn away from some things. I had to grow up through pure intelligence. I grew up without a father. My father wasn't there for me and stuff like that. I became the head of my household and stuff like that. I'd take care of my mom, my brother. Even my mom would get married to these, the men, a lot of the men she got married to. Um, and also, all the dating she did, she would, a lot of those guys and stuff like that was immature. And that's when I started to learn that people have arrested development at a certain time, at a certain age, and it's like they don't develop past that. And that's what a lot of the things that's going on today. So you start with, especially in the black community, we have families and shit like that. And then all of a sudden that family breaks apart. The father leaves or the mother is stuck, raising his child on her own and he's not getting everything he needs. At that point, his development is rested. When you break up families, when you get in divorces, I'm splitting up the household. As soon as you do that, that child's development is arrested at that moment. They can't go any further than that, you know. And this is what we see. We see a lot of this stuff. You see sexual molestation. You see all types of things that's going on. People, parents don't teach children to be adults anymore. They don't teach them anything. They just provide for them and just expect them to grow up. They hand them over to the school system. And you see what the school system is teaching, a bunch of bullshit, but a lot of alternative ideologies and all kind of things that don't correlate, with the nuclear family. And so you're being taught all this stuff, that causes confusion, things that don't, where things don't really have a definition. Everything is kind of just subjective. You can, you do what you want to do. You decide what you want to do. You be who you want to be. That's not You can't do that. Everybody has to have an identity. When you don't have an identity, these are the problems that we see. This is why you have people killing each other. They don't care about themselves. They don't care about anybody else. They don't have an identity. Nothing matters to them. That everything is indifferent. That's the problem. When you take away somebody's identity, when you take away their development, this is what happens. You know what I mean? And so parents aren't teaching their children anything nowadays. They giving them iPads, they letting them watch TV, they hand them over to school system, social media. They don't teach them their values. They don't teach them what they should be doing, as a woman, or what they should be doing as a man, you know. And so they just allow society to teach them. And you see how crooked and crazy society is. Why would you leave it to society to teach your children? You know what I mean? This is what we see. I keep telling people all the time. You talk about thugs and stuff like that. A thug is an effeminate man. Many people think that effeminate men walk around flamboyantly. We call them homosexuals and stuff like that. That's not true. Effeminate men are also men like thugs who walk around trying to intimidate other people, quick to violence, stealing, robbing, killing, indifferent, only care about themselves. That's an effeminate man as well. And people don't understand that. This is a product of many people being raised by women. They don't have a man in the house to teach this child or this man how to control his emotions, how to handle things correctly. We don't fight. You don't just walk around fighting people. You don't just walk around, having outbursts of anger. You have to learn how to control that. When it comes to confrontation with people, you have to learn how to communicate. A lot of these people don't know how to communicate and shit like that. And so they just lash out and stuff like that. You have to make deals, with conflict and stuff like that. You have to reason. You know what I mean? And this is what I tell people before, like, people talking about, oh, I don't care, I don't care. When you get on somebody's nerve to a point where, like, you know what? I don't care. And stuff like that. And I'm like, whenever the words you don't care come out of your mouth when you got other people underneath your care, that's a disaster. You know what I mean? I had that mentality growing up. Like I said, I have to learn everything through pure intelligence. And so, there's a couple times, where I got into it with guys. Like, one time, it was like 10 dudes, picking on my little brother and stuff like that, and I got into it with these dudes, like that. And I'm over here having to defend myself and my brother and his friends and shit like that. It's like 10 dudes, jumped on me and shit like that. And like, at the time, I've always been pretty rough and shit like that. But when I got into that fight, I'm like, I mean, is this all y'all really got? I was gonna stand up. I was gonna take them all on. Then they seen that what they were doing wasn't really doing nothing to me, and so they're like, you know what? Let's just shoot him instead. And at that point, I'm thinking about, all the things I gotta do. I'm thinking about, my mom, my brother. I need to protect them. I gotta be here. So at that point, I had to cower. Act like they was doing something to me and stuff like that, in order to get out of that situation. You know what I mean? And that's what I did. And that's what it did. It went from all these people jumping me, went down to 4 to 2, and then they just gave up and left. You know what I mean? And sometimes you got to do that. You know what I mean? To survive. That's what's being a man. Most of these guys, they wouldn't do no shit like that. Like I said, these children today, they are indifferent. They would go out in a blaze of glory for nothing. You know what I mean? They would kill somebody over nothing. You know what I mean? And so it's not evil spirits, it's the way people are being raised. That's what it is. It's not some demonic spirit or anything like that. It's just the way people are raised. We have separated ourselves so far from naturality or nature that we don't understand how things work. Just like nobody teaches on the subconscious how the subconscious mind works. You know what I mean? And it's just not something people do. Most people who do talk about the subconscious, it's usually always spiritual people. And they always have some spiritual meaning behind these things. But we dealing with all these type of mental conditions like bipolar and schizophrenia and all these types of things. These things come from the way people are being raised. It's due to trauma. It's mostly due to like sexual trauma and stuff like that. You may have like this woman who's molested at a young age, and she leads her children in the same way, that she lives her life. And so her children also becomes that way. It's because of the way they're being raised. You see, the things that she's allowing them to be exposed to, she's not correcting their behavior, because she's been through this and this is the way she lives her life. That's why you see that kind of stuff. If a man was in the house, he'd be like, no, we need to correct this behavior. But that's what I'm saying, and especially due to the feminist movement, women have become like men, and men can't really put up with women these days. That's why we see this dynamic today where men and women are almost like enemies. You know, women are constantly trying to divorce their husbands and stuff like that because they feel as though they're neglected or this and that because simply they don't know what a man is. And so they have this idea of what they think a man is, and so they get in a relationship and they think that a man is going to treat them in the way that they expect to be treated, but then they understand like no, that's not the case, and so then they want to run out of one relationship, run into another one, and it's the same freaking thing. And so we get to a point where we got all these women out here with all these children, and multiple baby daddies and all this kind of stuff, and they out here still trying to look for relationships. You know what I mean? And it's a horrible thing. And that's what it is. Women today are they prioritize their careers, and they prioritize their status and all this kind of stuff, when if you were looking for a husband's not going to be interested in anything like that. I'm not looking for a woman who has a career, PhD, bachelor's degree, none of that kind of stuff, because that stuff instills masculine traits. That's the whole reason, before the feminist movement, women didn't have certain rights because their role didn't need those rights. Their role, they're outside of their nature. You know what I mean? And so that's why it's harder for women and men to get along now, because women are becoming men. And men don't like other men, especially not when it comes to relationships. You see what I'm saying? And this is the sort of thing that we're seeing now. And like I'm saying, this stuff is not demonic. There's nothing demonic about it. It's just the way people being raised. You know, what we're doing with science, what we're doing with evolution and all this kind of stuff. Like I said, it leads to emptiness. There's nothing. You know what I mean? And so when you raise people in these ways, they don't have identity. They don't have anything. That's the whole reason why we see a lot of people, going into fantasy now and wanting everybody to accept their fantasy, you know, and that's, it's a crazy thing, but that's what we're seeing. That's where society is headed. You know what I mean? And we need to address those issues. We need to get back to nuclear family and do all that stuff. That's why I'm for what Trump is doing, because it's forcing a lot of those corrections. That's where we're heading back to. And that's what happens once you step outside of nature. That's why I tell people, nature always finds a way. And I keep telling people as well, like, conservatism is based on the principles of life. That's why it doesn't matter how much liberals are going to argue, how much they're going to fight, how much they're going to target people. It doesn't matter. It's not going to go anywhere, because it's based on the foundations of life itself. You see what I'm saying? And so you can't change that. You can change that, but all it's going to lead to is dysfunction and chaos, and that's what we're in now. We're seeing the fallout of all this alternative lifestyles, of all this alternative ideologies, and all the I would say all the passiveness of society, all the tolerance of a lot of different ideologies and lifestyles, and that's what we're seeing. We're starting to see that. You can't allow criminals to do what they want to do. You can't allow the wicked of society to do what they want to do. It's only going to empower them. You know what I mean? And that's what we're seeing now in these sanctuary cities. They think, oh, we're going to handle this. We're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to handle the psychological issue. You can't handle the psychological issue, because your policies and everything you're about is fueling that. You see what I'm saying? The psychological issues are due to the changes that you made to policy by allowing that. You see what I'm saying? And so, when you become less straight, it's like the way I would like to put it is, it's like we've been giving children too much power. You can't allow children to have too much power. Children are children. They don't know what's best for them. They don't know what they're doing. All they know is what feels good, what tastes good, and that's what they want to do, what makes them feel good, right? But we know that we can't always do what feels good, because what always feels good to you can be dangerous, and so it's like that's what we done in society, feminism and all these types of things, that's what they lead to, what makes you feel good, it's not necessarily what's right, it's what makes you feel good. People like to say, women didn't have those rights, and that's not human. That goes against humanity and shit like that. No, it doesn't. Women didn't need those rights. If you know what a woman's role is, she doesn't need those rights. A woman is supposed to be somebody who is interdependent, which means she relies on her husband for all things. She's supposed to help her husband, help me. That's exactly what it is. You know what I mean? And so a woman doesn't need that role. You know, when a man had the right to vote, he comes home and him and his wife decides on the candidate within their household. So the woman was still voting. She was just voting through her husband. You know what I mean? Her husband is her leader. She's supposed to submit to him in the first place. If she doesn't want to submit to him, why did she marry him? You know what I mean? That's a woman's role, to submit to a leader. We see it in nature, we see it everywhere. That's the nature of a woman. You see what I mean? And so what feminism did is turn that on its head. And so now women are no longer women, they're men. You see what I'm saying? They got egos like men. They got pride like men. Independent like men. And so you can't have two independent people in the household. You can't have two leaders in the household. You know what I mean? It's always going to cause dysfunction, and that's what women are seeing. You know, you know, you I do that all the time. I used to be a doc lead and stuff like that, and people have a problem with authority. People didn't want to listen to me and stuff like that. I had to prove myself to them, and stuff like that in order for them to listen. And that's the thing, when you have a group of men, another man is not going to follow another man unless you can prove yourself to them. You have to prove, that you are worthy to be followed and stuff like that. And so that's the case. When you have like a hierarchy like that and you have all these men, these men, especially in the past, we used to fight amongst each other, for leadership and stuff like that, and we still do. You can't be like that in the household. I mean, that's kind of like what the modern relationship is, right? The woman's constantly always arguing, constantly always fighting. That's why we see that, because it's like two men trying to be in a household and trying to make a place where there should be only one person leading. And so we're trying to lead with two separate people in the house, with two people in the household and stuff like that. And that's what's causing a lot of the clashing that's going on. You see what I'm saying? And like I said, men don't get along like that. And also that's what you see, So like when these relationships start, you're in that infatuation stage, where you don't know this much about this person and you want to get to know this person. That's fun and fascinating, and it's a joy, to do those kind of things, to learn about somebody you don't know, and try to win them over. It's just like the animal kingdom. It's just like peacocks, birds. These male animals do these funny looking dances and stuff like that and expose themselves in ways they normally wouldn't if it wasn't mating season. Most of these male animals are always on guard looking for other males or looking for any threats. But when it comes to mating season, they do all these things to entice the females, to find a mate. And so it's like the same thing that we do when we come into new relationships when it comes to dating and stuff like that. And sometimes that phase can go up to 2 years. Sometimes some people can make it stretch. But, you know, eventually you got to have other relationship skills to make that relationship last longer. You know what I'm saying? And so eventually that stage goes away. You know what I mean? And so especially, when it comes to men, once we start providing for our family, there's much more things on our plate. Man, we can't afford to fail. So we always gotta be in this place of, we gotta continue to make money for the family. I can't fuck up. Otherwise I can lose the house. Otherwise, my family's gonna be on the street. So we got a lot more responsibility even outside of our wives and shit like that. And women don't take that shit into consideration. And so it's a lot of things, that eventually begin to be neglected, and that's why the woman is supposed to be a woman, a feminine, exuberant woman, because those things that she have is going to pull her husband back to her. You know what I mean? Like when it comes to intimacy and stuff, women are supposed to tease men. She's supposed to entice us and tease us and stuff like that. Because if you don't do that, if you don't advertise a product, nobody's ever going to buy it. And so women today, they're lazy. They just want to sit back and collect compliments and um all this praise and be worshipped and stuff like that. And like they don't understand that. And so it's not a man's nature to do that. All those type of things in the beginning relationship, the texting, the hugging, the holding, holding the attention, the kissing, the gestures, buying gifts, all that type of stuff. That's not a man's nature. You know what I mean? All that stuff is feminine. And so, yes, in the beginning, men do stuff like that, but eventually, it's going to slow down, it's going to stop. And so the woman is the one who's supposed to keep bringing our attention back to her, that we continue to do those things because that's what she wants to do. That's the way, that's where her love language is. And so you got to continue, to bring him back to that. You know what I mean? And so women don't do that. Eventually they stop doing that because they stop getting attention. And it becomes like this vindictive thing. They start withholding sex, they start doing all these other things, and their relationships just continues to get sour. And they don't understand. They think that bullying and doing all this kind of stuff is going to make the man start doing it. It doesn't work that way. You'd be surprised. And I'm not going to say, there are some men out there, who, no man wants to lose their wife and shit like that. I mean, there is love, but you have to understand the man's nature. That's the problem today. Women don't know what men are, and men don't know what women are, right? Because nobody's ever being taught that anymore. You know what I mean? Ever since feminism, the woman's role has been flipped on its head. And so women are no longer women, they're men. You see what I'm saying? And there are some women still out there. Some parents are teaching their daughters how to be wives. You know what I mean? And so, but most of them don't. And so most people keep teaching their daughters, oh, go and get your career, go and get your schooling done or whatever, and then once you're done with schooling, try to find a husband and stuff like that. It don't work like that. Women's sexual value starts when they're young, straight out of high school and stuff like that. The longer you spend, in school, that value goes down. You know what I mean? Because no high value men are just not looking for no older women. You know what I mean? And that's what they end up doing. They get into their upper 20s, upper 30s, and then they want to come and start looking for a husband and stuff like that. That's normal for a man. That's what we do, because that's usually when we start to get into most of our success in our lives. Immature men out of high school, going into college and stuff, they still working on themselves and trying to build, you know, for their future family and stuff. They're not usually done with that until around 30 or 40. And that's when we start making our real money and stuff like that. Even with me, I've been working a lot of, low wage jobs and stuff like that. It wasn't until around 34 or 35 that I actually started making salary and stuff like that. And that's the way we are, and so women can't do that. Women aren't like us. They're being taught like they're like us. That's what the whole feminine movement was, to make them like us. And so now they're trying to do the same thing, but your resources and stuff like that, your whole purpose is to find a man. And that man is the one who's providing you with those resources. But you're trying to get those resources on your own. And then once you get them, then you're trying to look for a man. A man doesn't need that. You see what I'm saying? A man needs a relationship. He needs a family. He needs a legacy and stuff like that. And so once he start getting his money, he's going to look for a younger woman. And that's why we starting to see so many at least older women, single. And that's what we're seeing, especially in the black community is very bad. But that's what we're waking up to, and that's what this is just one part of it. That's why I'm saying, it's the feminist shit. It's a lot of the alternative lifestyles and ideologies, and it's the way people are being raised and stuff like that. It ain't got nothing to do with demonic spirits. It don't have nothing to do with anything that has anything to surrounding religion. It's just simple everyday stuff. It's like if you don't pay attention to stuff. That's why I keep telling people, with propaganda and watching all these news stations and watching all this YouTube, and you got to pick through all this shit. A lot of shit's not real, and there's a lot of things that people are talking about that's just common sense. You know what I mean? There's a lot of things, just like when we talk about health and stuff. You don't need pills, you don't need pharmaceuticals, you don't need any of that stuff to stay healthy. You know what I mean? You don't need anything to stay healthy. Honestly, if you want to stay healthy, try fasting. Fasting is the best way to stay healthy because all the damage that's being done in your body, when you fast, your body has a chance to do that instead of spending all this time with digestion. When you eating 3 meals a day, that body is always digesting food. You know what I mean? And so when does the detoxification come in? So how is your body going to heal from all the damage that's being done? You got to give the body a break. That's what fasting is. You know, Even with me, being overweight and stuff like that my whole life. I only eat 1 meal a day. I usually spend like 1 hour eating, 4 hours digesting. And the rest of the time, I'm fasting for the rest of the day, and so that's why I don't have diabetes. That's why I don't have any type of sicknesses, even being morbidly obese, BMI almost 48. You know what I mean? And it's been like that for my whole life. That's the reason why. You know what I mean? Like I said, it's all the way you've been raised and stuff like that. We grew up eating Southern cooking, bacon, and all this kind of stuff. We continue that. And that's what happens, colon. Where do colon cancers come from? It comes from all these men eating all this fucking pork and barbecue. That's where it comes from. When you constantly drinking beer and eating barbecue, that's what happens. You know, that's why it's so common, especially in the black community and stuff like that. And so once you fast, stay away from these things for long periods of time, your body repairs itself. You know what I mean? That's what health is. You can't give the body anything to make it more healthy. You know, you can't. The only thing you could do is give it what it needs. You know what I mean? But anyway, I don't want to go too far off topic. But yeah. And so these conversations, we need to have. We need to start talking about the way people are being brought up, because a lot of people don't talk about that, especially in the black community. There's a lot of um things going on. We don't have parents teaching us anything. Like, I grew up in the hood. I can't remember one time any parent teaching anything beneficial to their children. It's like in the hood, all you do is provide them with nutrients. All you do is put a roof over their head, and you just expect them to grow up. That's not how you um develop children. Children don't develop like that. You don't teach them your values. Like, you don't teach them your beliefs. You don't teach them, all that kind of stuff. That's what's giving them identity. If they don't have no identity, they have nothing. You know what I mean? And so that's what we really need to be talking about. We need to be more serious about fathers in the home and stuff like that. We already know this. They don't like to talk about it because this is what I'm talking about. Women have had this women have had this protection ever since the feminist movement and shit like that. And so you never hear the man's side. You always hear the woman's side. That's what we talk about. With Kevin Samuels and Alicia, Moray, and also Stephen Darby. Men like that. Who passed on, but they are the ones who was teaching the black community, all these types of things. Because why did they always focus on the man's side? They focus on the man's side because you never heard the man's side. You've always heard the females. You know what I mean? You hear men talking about, oh, men are dogs and stuff like that. They leave their children and stuff. Like, Like literally sitting in the house right now, single. You know, I'm not single, but separated right now for the same reason. Men don't want to be separated and single from their children. It's just one that ended up happening. Sometimes women are just hard to deal with, and that's the reason why they left. And that's a lot of the reason why they left in the past. Then also in the past, women went after provision. They went for housing, they went for welfare, they went for all those things, and they left their men because they knew they could be better on their own. They knew that they don't have to worry because the government was going to provide for them. So that's another thing that happened in the past. Even today they still doing that, and that's why Trump is getting rid of a lot of that shit. You know, that's why they're changing laws. Like when a marriage breaks up, the child doesn't always go with the mother anymore. So now child support. They're doing stuff with child support in some states and stuff like that. So that's another thing. So women won't be able to get child support for the children and stuff like that. They're gonna have to work. They're gonna have to do this. They want to be like men, so they're gonna really be like men. They're gonna have to work, and do all the things that men do. You know what I mean? And so like this is pretty much just undoing all the things that's been done. It's like yeah, we started with the feminist movement, but now look, men don't have rights and shit in society. Now men are being looking looked down upon and stuff like that and being treated unfairly. So now we got this masculinist movement that's coming up. You know what I mean? And that's the thing, it's crazy. But that's the way it is. Women have left their role and completely flipped their role on its head. And so men have always stayed in their own role and stuff like that. And that's what I'm talking about. All the conversations we always been hearing is always the woman's side. You don't never hear the man's side because a woman have been like a protected resource all this time. And so, you don't hear nothing bad about women. It's always men. Always men doing this, men doing that. Men ain't doing nothing but providing for their families and trying to make it work with these females. And these females are hard to get along with. And that's why in the black community, the black man has always went after the white woman because she's more polite. You don't have to put up with attitude. She does stuff, when you tell her to do it. And it ain't got nothing to do with no being no slave and shit like that. It's a man is a leader. We lead shit. That's what we do. And so if you with somebody who doesn't want to be led, you know what I mean? That means you're not needed. Men are driven by need. If I'm not needed, I don't want to be there. I don't need to be there. I need to be with some place where I'm needed. You know what I mean? And that's the thing, the feminist movement told you don't need men. No, you don't need men. So go out and be a man. You know what I mean? And so like that's why black men have always went towards white women, because they're a lot easier to deal with. They are more feminine, exuberant, polite, you know, um, they're interdependent, not independent, you know. Um, there's a lot of especially, and we always talk about white women and stuff like that, but it's actually the ones that most people usually go for are foreign women. It's just like here domestically, the closest you can get to a foreign woman is the white woman. You see what I'm saying? And or the Hispanic woman, because their Hispanics are also still being taught traditionally, and so you can also find women there, but for the most part, that's the reason why black women are very hard to deal with, and it's ever since history, all throughout history. It started back in slavery with buck breaking, where the slave master would humiliate these black men in front of their wives and stuff like that. They would emasculate them, and at that point, the women seen these men as weak and can't protect them, and so they would always go after the slave master. And that's sort of like the same thing that transfer over to today, because now women go after after they rely on the government, which was the slave master, and they don't they don't see any value in black men and stuff like that, and it's kind of crazy how a lot of these other races do, and and that's why black women are losing their black men to all these other races and stuff like that because of what they've been taught, how they see themselves, you know all this pride and ego and stuff like that. Like I said, we had the feminist movement. All women were, and all women today, all modern women are still going after that shit. But for the most part, the black community had it the worst. You know, the black women, like I said, just had many levels of it. You had buck breaking. You had welfare. Once all that stuff started, you had the feminist movement, and so like all that stuff plays into it. And so when black women completely separated themselves from their men, completely. And this is the fallout that we're going through today. And this is the whole reason why we have, so much of this stuff going on in sanctuary cities, with these black men, young black men and women killing each other and stuff like that. It's because of that. It all comes from that. With that family structure, no black family structure, all these people being raised by single women who can't give them what they need, their development become arrested. You know what I mean? The IQ remains low. There's some people who go to school or college and stuff like that, but that doesn't really change anything. You know what I mean? It takes special people like me. I was one of those special people. I had to learn everything through pure intelligence, and I had to look at other men around me and see their failures and see their success, and I had to pick and choose between, I've seen it all the time. I've seen the way a lot of these black males and stuff growing up in the hood would beat their children, and I seen what their children become. They became bullies, they became murderers, they became deviants. And so I said I'm not gonna do that. If I abuse my child, I'm gonna have to do it in a more educated way. I'm gonna have to do it based on intelligence. You know what I mean? If you discipline somebody, you have to tell them why. That's the steps, right? You go from punishment. From discipline to punishment. To there's steps to it and stuff like that. That's why we tell them, like, stop doing that, stop doing that. Oh, it's time for discipline. You know what I'm like? Now it's time for punishment. You know what I mean? There's a structure to things, and you have to learn that through pure intelligence. The IQ of the black community is very low. So they don't think like that. They think, oh, you could just abuse people, and no, you create monsters when you do that. You know what I mean? It's crazy, man. There's so many people I used to hang out with growing up who were like that. People became monsters, just fighting people and just threw away their life. Most of them are dead or in prison right now. They're not on the streets. And that's a product of that. Think you could just tell your daughters, oh, go focus on your career and stuff like that. If she's trying to find a husband, the husbands don't care about her career. I don't care about her career. You know what I mean? My career is the only career that should be mattering because I'm the one who's going to be working, supporting the family. She's the one who's supposed to be teaching the children, homeschooling them or teaching them what they need to know. That's what she's going to be doing. That's the traditional way. So when you have all this untraditional shit, it's the same thing. Like the children are just growing up. They're not learning anything. They have no identity. That's what a lot of these people don't understand when you have all these weird looking families with two fathers and mothers and all this shit going on. They have no identity. That's the whole problem. That's the whole plus off of the end of the LGBTQ. The plus. That's what that is. Even many members of the LGBTQ itself, have identity crisis, and that's what I'm talking about. A lot of it, we need to start touching on a lot of this type of stuff. This sexual molestation that happens at young ages, that produces trauma. That trauma can, express itself as schizophrenia. People can become confused, homosexuality, and all kinds of stuff. You know what I mean? Bipolar, and the next thing they opening up relationships with people that leads to the same thing for their daughters or for their sons. You know what I mean? Or they leading them in the same way, down the same path, and not even knowing it. And so that's how these families end up like that. You know, that's how people end up out here like that. You have to teach your children. You know what I mean? You have to lead them in the way they should go. Don't, this is the problem. This is why we have so many people out here, like people who've been assassinating people lately. It's because the parents, don't take any interest in their beliefs or their thoughts and ideas anymore. They just let them do what they want to do. You can't allow children to do that. Especially when it comes to this new transgender shit. And, you see a lot of these parents asking their 1 year old daughter, 2 year old daughter, what do you want to be? Do you feel like you're a boy or a girl? A child should never be put in a place where they should even ever have to ask that for them, or even have to answer that for themselves. You know what I mean? That's wrong for a parent to even do something like that. And what is the mindset of those parents to think like that? You see what I'm saying? And that's the type of shit we dealing with society. No identity. If you let that child do whatever they want to do, they have no identity. You know, they should be learning the values you grew up with. Is that what you grew up with? This husband and wife are together. They have the traditional relationship, and you sitting over here asking your 1 or 2 year old daughter, is she going to consider an alternative one? Like, what are you doing? You see what I'm saying? People are the problem. This ain't got nothing to do with demonic shit. It's just the way you being brought up. It's the things you believe, the things you being taught in society. Well, anyways, I've talked too much, but I just wanted to touch on that. But thanks for listening.